Hey there everybody, this is Scott from Standy Ground Studio, and today we need to talk about the Chilcot Report, which came out yesterday. And this is the next step in exposing the corruption behind our politics and the wars in the Middle East, like I've been talking about on this channel. And in short, John Chilcot, who is the chairman of a British inquiry into the UK's role in the Iraq War, released findings from a 7-year investigation early yesterday morning. And while it's not a direct indictment of Tony Blair, it is being touted as damning evidence in his decision-making and how the UK was pulled into the war. And of course, this opens the door to questions about Bush's role, but that's a little bit further down the road. Now, before I get the inevitable comment asking what you get your news from CNN now, I'm going to reiterate this one more time. This is the establishment taking the next step in calling out its own corruption because it's time for the masses to slowly wake up to the collusion that led us here. Everything I show you today is a projection out to the masses. And as you know, most people won't believe information like this until their TV or favorite news publication tells them to believe it. So, if you're familiar with my channel, you know exactly why I'm pointing all this out. If not, go check out my playlist, The Road to World War III Exposes the Hierarchy. It ties into everything I talk about in those first few videos. And I'm going to be pointing a little bit of that out in this video here. Okay, good. So, like I've been saying from the beginning, we need a bad guy to focus on. And that's usually how a script works, and they're going to give that to us here in the form of Bush and Blair. And in this video that's loaded up on the screen here, I'm going to play about a minute of it. It's being billed here as Bush and Blair's war. This is their doing. This is their brainchild is how they're billing this. And as you watch this video for about a minute, notice how mainstream media suddenly has the wherewithal to piece together the suspicious timing.
It has always been our policy that Iraq would be a better place without Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein's regime is a grave and gathering danger.
He has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes.
Okay, so notice how suspicious they're making it all sound between the music and that typewriter effect and how they're lining it all up. I mean, they could have done this years ago, but now it's time for us to be talking about it. All right, so I'm going to read through select passages in a few articles here, and as I do, keep these themes in mind going forward. This opens the door to why Blair was on board from the start, which of course points right to Bush and his administration and everything he did. That's going to tie into 9/11, of course. The wars had a horrendous toll on human life and gave rise to a new level of extremist terrorism, most commonly characterized by ISIS, and how that ties in with the refugee crisis and national security, and also how hurt everyone is on the inside from 9/11 and the 2 wars that resulted from it. Of course, going forward, we're going to be getting larger doses of truth than usual, but, as usual, only enough to drive suspicion through the roof on all fronts. And as I read some of the names and facts, notice the timing this has with the Brexit, security in Europe, and Russian aggression. So let's dive in. So John Chilcot said that the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein posed no imminent threat when the U.S.-led invasion launched in March 2003, and that while the military action against him might have been necessary at some point, the strategy of containment could have continued for some time. Chilcot said former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was warned of the risks of regional instability and the rise of terrorism before the invasion of Iraq, but pressed on regardless. Was it legal? What they're saying is that this report is not in and of itself going to be a direct indictment. It can be used as damning evidence in a different forum, though. Here's the 150-page report, embedded right here. You can download it yourself if you want to look through it. Again, the infographics showing us just how much information and how overwhelming it all is. It took longer to put together than it did for the actual war. Blair did have his response, and he is expressing sorrow. He does not deny that it all ended up terribly like it did. But while acknowledging all the problems that came with that decision, Blair said, "What I cannot do and will not do is say I believe we took the wrong decision. I believe I made the right decision, that the world is better and safer as a result of it." He's saying no lies or deceit happened, that he made his decision in all fairness and with all due expediency, and that it was very binary. It was stay or go. And a lot of people, of course, are not believing him and really want to see this guy either go to jail or get hanged or fill in the blank however you want to. That's what people are thinking. Again, these are the bad guys. Calls for action against Blair, and that's tied into veterans' families. Loved ones died in vain. Again, this is why I said in my first video on it, this is going to work because they're just putting a spotlight on all the pain and devastation that's brought on everyone, and that's going to really bring up a lot of hate and anger when corruption really comes out. There's an interesting timing. So again, think of the Brexit through all of this. Outgoing British Prime Minister David Cameron, who was in favor of the war at the time, said that despite the damning findings, Britain would not retreat from taking military action in the future. It would be wrong to conclude that we shouldn't stand with our American allies when our common security interests are threatened. Taking the country to war should always be the last resort and should only be done if all credible alternatives have been exhausted. British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, who fervently opposed the war as one of Blair's backbenchers at the time, said the war was an act of military aggression launched on a false pretext, and demonstrated the need for stronger oversight of security and intelligence services. I find it interesting that all these names are suddenly coming up and how they're directly opposed with the Brexit, now they're directly opposed with this. And at the exact same time, Russian Embassy UK comes out with a tweet saying, "Keep calm, but I told you so." Chilcot Inquiry, no real WMD in Baghdad, unjust and highly dangerous war, the entire region on the receiving end. So that's them poking a finger at the Western powers that be. So here's another article released pretty much at the exact same time as the report did. So this is like prep work, what you should be thinking. You know, what Tony Blair and George W. Bush left behind in Iraq. Same video was there. And again, so another interesting timing was one of the worst bombings in Baghdad ever throughout all this time happened the weekend before. The false pretenses of Iraq's liberation. So again, this is the projection. The pretenses so strenuously pushed by Bush and Blair for the invasion of Iraq have proven utterly false. Whether they were lies or just monumental misjudgments, we may never know, but the consequences are plain for all to see. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There is no peace and prosperity in Iraq today. What passes for democracy, slapped together by the U.S. occupation, is fundamentally flawed and dangerously unstable. What they left behind, the entity Bush and Blair helped create, today's Iraq, is one of the most corrupt countries on earth. It floats on a sea of oil, but little of that wealth trickles down to ordinary people. Water and electricity cuts are commonplace. Again, tying into the refugee crisis here. Last summer, covering the massive refugees and migrants who were trying to get to Europe, I met dozens of Iraqis who had given up on their country. Stuck on the border with Hungary, Hussein, 22-year-old law student from Karbala, told me, "We will wait here 6 years if we have to. We have nothing left to lose." Returning to Iraq, he insisted, was not an option. And I'll point out what I talked about earlier with the refugee crisis and ISIS being tied together. Real quick, though, from this BBC report, which came out about the same time, Tony Blair's Iraq war case not justified. It's a long one. You can dig into this yourself. I just want to bring up one point. You know these had to come up. The Blair-Bush memos. So Blair just gave his defense saying that it was in all fairness. I didn't deceive anybody. I didn't have any ulterior motives. You know, I did everything in the best interest of the country and what I thought was best at the time. So of course we have these memos here to completely refute that, but not give you any answers at the same time. So yeah, the momentum towards going to Iraq spiked after 9/11, of course. A couple of quotes from Blair. How we finish in Afghanistan is important to phase 2, which is Iraq. We shall give regime change a good name, which will help in our arguments over Iraq. If you read any description of the memos, they are totally suspicious in every way that there was some form of collusion and planning going on and that they had ulterior motives left and right. And in my first presentation on this, I put all these up on the screen because it is driving up suspicion, but it also came out at the exact same time that all this came out with 9/11, and I talk all about that in that article. But if you go back and you read anything about those memos, here's the one thing I really want you to notice. It's all about how Bush and Blair deceived the UN Council and how they subverted every attempt to take proper measures to make sure we don't go into war too fast. And every time you read it, there's building a huge degree of separation between what Bush and Blair did and what the UN wanted. So as they expose all these lies, These are the bad guys we're supposed to be catching and anyone they're associated with. Meanwhile, the UN are the bad guys we're not supposed to catch. I just really want to point that out. Now, if you read these articles, you'll note how they really go into the death toll of it all, the cost of it all, and how it's tied to all the destruction, and how the turnout was awful. And like I mentioned in my video, ISIS will spread like a cancer, Road to World War III. ISIS and the refugee crisis, like you just heard, are tied to one another. So as one gets worse, the other is going to get worse with it. We can't separate the two of them. But also, we've been saying this for a while, the cost of it all has been huge. I mean, the endless amounts of billions of dollars that were spent, the hundreds of thousands at least of people that have been killed. The region has been totally destabilized, and we're in a worse result than we were when we started. They really want the public to know this now because they want us to start questioning how it is that we got here, and they're going to demand an accounting of really just what happened before we go further down this road. So again, the cost was not what was promised, the result was not what was promised, and the final promise that we'll at least get out of this war, they're backpedaling on that too. And right around the end of 2014, Obama said that the war in Afghanistan was essentially over. But then by October 2015, he backpedaled on that and said, well, actually, it's going to have to be about 5,500 troops to stay through the end of 2016. And at the same time that this is coming out, we're slowly ramping up our presence in Iraq. Not enough to start another war, just enough to know that the cost is still going up. And the reason why that is, and I pointed this out before, the region is becoming destabilized. So the more ISIS spreads, the more refugees have to also spread to Europe. And the more they can do that, the more that ISIS can spread to Europe. And the more we end up in this damning cycle. So we kind of have to keep building up our presence there. So, within a few hours of all of this being published, guess what this guy came out and said?
I'm announcing an additional adjustment to our posture. Instead of going down to 5,500 troops by the end of this year, the United States will maintain approximately 8,400 troops in Afghanistan into next year through the end of my administration. The narrow missions assigned to our forces will not change. They remain focused on supporting Afghan forces and going after terrorists. But maintaining our forces at this specific level, based on our assessment of the security conditions and the strength of Afghan forces, will allow us to continue to provide tailored support to help Afghan forces continue to improve. When we first sent our forces into Afghanistan 14 years ago, few Americans imagined we'd be there in any capacity this long. As president, I focused our strategy on training and building up Afghan forces. It has been continually my belief that it is up to Afghans to defend their country. Because we have emphasized training their capabilities, we've been able to end our major ground war there and bring 90% of our troops back home. But even as we work for peace, we have to deal with the realities of the world as it is. And we can't forget what's at stake in Afghanistan. This is where al-Qaeda is trying to regroup. This is where ISIL continues to try to expand its presence. If these terrorists succeed in regaining areas and camps where they can train and plot, they will attempt more attacks against us. We cannot allow that to happen.
Okay, so there you go. They followed through on that promise perfectly. And again, I'm able to predict some of this stuff like I do because basically they project it to us ahead of time. So that's really all that is. And the exact same presentation, in fact, in the exact same article where they say ISIS is going to spread like a cancer, and the U.S. Air Force General Philip Breedlove is telling us that, he goes on to say, Russia contributing to instability. Breedlove also pointed a finger at a resurgent, aggressive Russia, which poses a long-term and existential threat to the U.S. and our European allies. Meanwhile, Putin is saying basically the same thing about NATO, and you know how that's going. So again, within an hour or two of this coming out, this article comes out saying Putin flexes muscle with Russian-U.S. military close calls. So this is them finally admitting it. The repeated close encounters between Russian and U.S. warships and planes may not be an accident. That's the view of analysts who are coming to believe that the risky Russian maneuvers, there have been at least 6 close calls this year, are part of Vladimir Putin's strategy aimed at challenging the U.S.'s global position and intimidating its European allies. No kidding, right? So they go on to mention a bunch of the incidents that happened, and I do remember most of them. The last one was a flyby of a U.S. warship, and I do remember this quote from that article. So it was about the captain's decision not to do anything about it and keeping cool. And Kerry told CNN en Espanol that under the rules of engagement, that could have been a shoot down, so people need to understand that this is serious business. Many see the spate of incidents not as accidents, but as intentional moves by the Russian president, like we've been saying for how many years now? Putin is trying to send a message to America's partners. To America's European allies, the Kremlin is messaging that the U.S. cannot protect them from Russia if Russia wants to do something to them militarily. Oh, and this right here reeks of World War II. And Putin warned Finland this week against joining NATO, telling reporters after a meeting with the Finnish president that if the country became part of the Western military bloc, do you think we will keep it as is? Our troops at 1,500 kilometers or 900 miles away? That's a direct threat right there. And of course, they end on this note. When he starts operating planes and ships near our major vessels on the water, there is potential for a major ship disaster. And you know it's coming. You know it's coming. We all do. It's in our subconscious. That's why we all kind of talk about it. The only question is, will you choose to accept it? And that comes down to the individual. So, let's go ahead and wrap this up. So going forward, we're all going to get a lot of info to drive up speculation and make certain parties look guilty as hell. A lot of developments will be left open-ended so that we all project onto them our own theories and dig ourselves in deeper on our own beliefs and generally on fighting the system as well as each other. Every theme that I've mentioned here and elsewhere, terrorism, nationalism, global war, the economy, they're all drifting closer and closer together, leading to the perfect storm. You can see here how they're all kind of overlapping with one another. And like I said, it's all going to come back to 9/11 and the Bush administration, at least here in the U.S. Meanwhile, Obama's going to hold up the 9/11 bill and the release of the 28 missing pages. Then we get hit harder with more terrorist attacks. So that at the back end of it all, when it finally comes out, it's going to be a lot of corruption coming out to basically set off the perfect storm. I know it's not that simple, but you see where I'm going with this. It's going to look like an organic development of a whole bunch of situations. So I'm going to end on the final note, which is why I made this channel. There's only one truth, capital T, and that really is in Jesus Christ. And I say that because as it goes forward and you're someone who doesn't believe that yet, and you start to see just how crazy this is going to become, just know that that invitation is there. It's a free gift for your salvation. I personally did not used to believe in it at all. I had messages coming to me my whole life I didn't understand. And then when I really started to see just how perfectly weaved this whole story is, for that and other reasons, I had to accept it. And I encourage you to accept his free gift as well, to repent of your sins and to keep up his commandments because he loves you in a way you don't know. This world is pure deception, all of it. If you have any further questions, please put them below. I look forward to your comments. Please share this video. Thank you for watching. I'll check you next time.